I knew the name before the stage cleared the river bend, because I'd been reading that passenger sheet for an hour, and I still hadn't found a way to carry it up to him. Nora Ellison, written plain in the agent's hand at Wallace Crossing, 3 lines down, a throughfare paid to Cedar Bend, no return. I had run the livery and the stage office in this town for going on 26 years, and in all that time I'd learned that some names weigh more than the paper they're set on. That one weighed more than the coach. I folded the sheet and put it in my vest and went out to stand in the cold morning where the road came down off the Ferris Bluffs, and I watched the dust on the far rise that meant the 4-up was an hour out, and I thought about Eli Renner up at Dawn Fork, mending the same fence he'd been mending since the Lord was young. And I thought, you old fool, you have to be the one to tell him. Because if he hears it from the boardwalk, he'll close up like a spring trap and ride off into the high country, and that'll be the end of it. So you understand the shape of this from the start. I'm not the man it happened to. I'm the man who watched it happen twice, with 15 years of nothing in between, and I'm telling it now because Eli never would, and because a thing this good shouldn't go in the ground with the two of us. My name is Asaph Pike. I'm old enough that my hands shake in the morning and steady by noon, and I have seen most of what a frontier town does to a heart. I had never, in all of it, seen one wait the way Eli Renner waited, without ever once admitting that was the word for what he was doing. Let me take you back, because you can't feel the return if you didn't stand at the parting. 15 years before that stage came down the Ferris Road, Eli Renner was a long-boned, dark-eyed ranch hand of 22 working the Ellison spread, which in those days was the biggest run of cattle in the whole valley, and the man who owned it was Hollis Ellison, and Hollis Ellison was the proudest man God ever set on a horse. I don't say that to bury him. I'll have more to say of Hollis before this is done, and not all of it hard. But pride was the timber he was built from, and it ran clean through him. He had come up from nothing, had Hollis, had carried his own water and broke his own broncs and clawed that valley out of the brush with his own 2 hands, and a man who builds himself from nothing will sometimes hold what he built tighter than is good for him. He held his land that way. He held his name that way. And he held his daughter that way. Nora Ellison was the only child Hollis had left living, her mother 3 years in the Cedar Bend ground and 2 little brothers gone before that to the fever. And so everything the man had to love he had poured into that one girl, and everything the man feared he had wrapped around her like a fence wrapped around a spring. She was 19 the summer Eli came on at the Ellison place, and I remember her from those years. I shod her mare 100 times, and what I remember is not that she was pretty, though she was, but that she looked at you straight. There was a steadiness in her you could have leaned a ladder on. She taught the little ones their letters in the linta behind the church before the town ever built a proper school. Did it for nothing. Did it because she couldn't abide a child growing up unable to read his own Bible, and she'd argue scripture with the circuit preacher till he took his hat and left, and she had a laugh that came up out of her sudden and whole, like water breaking out of rock. Eli loved her the way young men love when they've never done it before and don't know yet that it can be survived. Quiet, total, the kind of love that doesn't announce itself because it's too busy looking. And she loved him back. That's the part the town never got right in all the years of telling it wrong. They had it that the hired man set his cap above his station, and the cattleman's daughter never gave him a thought. That's a lie, and I knew it was a lie because I was the only soul in that valley they trusted with the truth of it. They used to meet at the old schoolhouse gate, not the school that stands now, the first one, the little plank building out past the Ellison line that the floods took in the end. There was a gate there, a sagging cedar gate on a fence that didn't fence anything anymore, and they'd meet there in the long blue evenings, and half the time the meeting was nothing, but the two of them leaning on opposite sides of that gate talking till the stars came out. He told me once it was the only place in the valley that belonged to neither her father nor his poverty, just a gate to nowhere where 2 young people could stand and be equal. I carried letters between them that summer when she couldn't get away. I won't pretend I didn't. A man who runs a livery is a man who knows the roads, and the roads are where a young pair's hearts go back and forth. I'd have walked into a river for either of them. It was in the fall that it broke. Hollis found out. Of course he found out a proud man's eyes are everywhere. And he did the thing a proud man does. He didn't rage. Rage would have been easier. You can forgive a man his temper. Hollis sat Eli down in the big front room of the Ellison house with the fire going, and he was perfectly, terribly calm. And he told Eli that he thought well of him, which was true, and that he saw he was a hard worker, which was true, and that he would never in this life let his daughter marry a man who came to her with nothing in his hands, because Hollis Ellison had married a girl whose father thought the same of him, and he had watched that good man die without ever once admitting he'd been wrong. And Hollis would be damned before he'd give his Nora to a winter of want the way his own wife had near gone. Eli told me afterward, white to the lips, that he understood it. That was the cruel part, he did understand it. He was a man with nothing. He couldn't argue the fact of it. So he made a bargain with himself that no one asked him to make. He'd go north. There was open range opening up past the Ferris headwaters, government land a man could prove out, and a syndicate hearing trail, bosses for the long drives up to the railheads, top wages for a man who could sit a horse and read cattle, and Eli could do both better than any man I ever saw. He'd go north, and he'd make himself into the kind of man Hollis Ellison couldn't refuse, and he'd come back for her with his hands full. He didn't tell Nora he was going. That was the mistake, the first stone of the whole avalanche. He was ashamed, I think, to ask her to wait for a thing he wasn't sure he could become. So he rode out before dawn one October morning, and he left her nothing but a word with me. Tell her I'll write, Asa. Tell her I'll write the minute I know I can make it true. And he was gone up the Ferris road in the gray before the light. He wrote, I want that understood, because the whole valley spent 15 years believing he didn't. He wrote her that first winter from a line camp so far north the ink froze in the bottle, and the letter went out with the freight that came down once a month. And I know it went out because he told me he'd sent it, and Eli Renner never lied to me once in his life. It never came, or it came and it never reached her. I'll get to which. The point you need now is only this. Nora Ellison waited at that cedar gate through the fall and into the winter in the cold, for a letter from a man who had vanished without a word, and no letter came, and no letter came, and no letter came. You can only stand at a gate so long before the cold gets into you. By spring the town had its story sewn up tight. The hired man had run off, used the girl for a summer's sport, and lit out the moment her father showed him the door. What else could you expect from a man with nothing? And Nora, who was too proud herself to go down the boardwalk swearing it wasn't so, let them say it, and went gray-faced about her teaching, and grew a quiet around herself that hadn't been there before. And Hollis, watching his daughter go quiet, did the second proud thing, which was worse than the first. He decided he'd been right, and he set about proving it. There was a man in the valley then, a young rancher named Del Marsh, sound family, good water rights, a future you could bank, and Hollis had it in his head that a match there would set his daughter up safe for life and put the foolishness of the hired man behind her for good. So he made the arrangement the way men of property made arrangements in those days, fathers and fathers across a fence, and the thing was as good as fixed before Nora was rightly asked. Here is where the town got it most wrong of all, and here is where I have to tell you the truest thing I know about Nora Ellison. She refused. She stood up in that big front room. I had it from the woman who cooked for the Ellisons, who heard the whole of it through the kitchen door. She stood up in front of her father and Del Marsh and Del's people, and she said she would not marry where she did not love, and that she would not be passed across a fence like a heifer to settle a man's pride, and that if her father wished to keep her, he could keep her unwed, and if he did not, she would teach school for her bread in any town that would have her, and she'd sooner. And then she walked out of her father's house with one carpetbag and the clothes she stood in, and she did not come back. She got a place teaching down in the territory south, 2 hard days' ride in a railroad town called Halcyon that didn't deserve her, and she taught there. Year on year. She never married Del Marsh. She never married anyone. The man she'd waited for at the gate had run off and broken her, the town said, and now look, she'd thrown over a good match and gone off alone, and wasn't that just like an Ellison, too proud by half? I never could make them see that it wasn't pride. It was that she'd been loved once truly, and she knew the weight of the real thing, and she would not put a counterfeit in its place. That's not pride. That's the opposite of it. That's a woman who knows exactly what a thing is worth. And Eli. Eli came back. 2 years and a winter after he'd gone, with money in the bank at Wallace Crossing and a deed to a quarter section of his own up at Dawn Fork on Quail Creek, the headwaters land nobody else had wanted because it ran high and cold. He came back the way he'd sworn he would, with his hands full at last, and he rode down the Ferris Road into Cedar Bend, and the first man he found was me. I'll carry the look on his face to my grave. He was so sure. He'd written, you see, and got no answer, and a young man with no answer tells himself she's waiting. She's only being held from writing, her father's at the letters. He'd built a whole hope on the silence. And he came down off that mountain to claim her, and the first thing out of the first mouth he met was, she's gone, Eli. Gone south. 2 winters back. Refused the Marsh boy and left her father's house, and nobody's heard a straight word since. He thought she'd married, that's the thing. The way the town told it, refused the Marsh match. Ran off, gone. A man hearing it raw and gutted could read it 40 ways. And the way Eli read it, standing in my office with the snow melting off his shoulders, was that she'd waited a decent while and then made her own life somewhere with somebody. And his letter had come too late or come and meant nothing. And who was he? A hired man 2 years gone without a word she'd ever received. To go chasing into another territory after a woman who'd plainly closed the door. I told him to go after her. God forgive me, I didn't tell him hard enough. I should have taken him by the collar. But I didn't know then about the letter. I only knew she'd gone and he'd come back, and the 2 of them had crossed in the dark like riders on a moonless road. And I thought, the way the whole world thinks when it's being a coward, that surely they'd find their own way to the truth. They didn't. He couldn't bear to chase a woman who might shut a door in his face. A proud man's son had his own pride, though it was a quieter make than Holly's. And she couldn't write to a man who'd left her standing at a gate for 2 years without a word. Each of them was waiting for the other to come, and each of them had been taught by silence that the other never would. So Eli took his money and his deed, and he rode up to Dawn Fork, and he built. And that's the man I want you to see now, because that's the man that stage was coming down the river to. He built the best small ranch in the high valley out of cold ground and stubbornness. He bought up the quarter sections around him, one bad winter at a time as other men gave out, and he ran good cattle and better horses, and within 10 years Eli Renner was a man of substance, the very kind of man Holly's Ellison had once said his daughter could only marry, and there was nobody to marry. He never courted. The valley sent its daughters and its widows up that mountain with pies and proposals for 15 years, and he was unfailingly kind to every one of them, and he married not a soul. He'd come down to the Cedar Bend church of a Sunday, sit in the back, leave before the visiting started. He'd come to my office to collect his freight and his mail. His mail, I should say, was always business, never once a letter from anyone who loved him. And he'd talk cattle and weather, and ride back up the mountain to that big cold house he'd built for a wife who never came. He got hard. I won't pretend he didn't. The years put flint in him. But I knew him before the flint, and I'll tell you that under it the man was exactly what he'd always been, which was a fellow who loved one thing wholly and had no idea on God's earth how to stop. And down in Halcyon, 2 days south, the schoolteacher who'd refused the world taught the children of strangers their letters, and grew a little gray at the temple, and kept, I would later learn, a sprig of dried mountain sage in the front of her Bible from a gate she'd stood at when she was 19. 15 years, that's the wait I'm telling you about. Now you know what the name on that passenger sheet weighed. I rode up to Dawn Fork that afternoon rather than send a boy, because some things a man does himself. The fall had come on early that year, gold in the aspen up the creek and the first hard frosts whitening the bottoms, and I found Eli where I knew I'd find him, out along the south fence with his coat off in the cold, driving staples like the fence had wronged him personally. "You're a long way up the mountain to bring me a bill, Asa," he said, not looking around. He always knew my horse. I didn't bring a bill. I sat there a minute. There's no clever way to set a 15-year-old wound back open, so I just did it plain. "There's a name on the through stage list for Thursday. Comes down from Wallace Crossing. I thought you'd want it from me and not the boardwalk." He drove a staple. "Whose name?" "Nora Ellison." He didn't move. I have seen men shot who moved more than Eli Renner moved when I said that name. He stood with the hammer hung dead at the end of his arm, and he looked at the fence wire like it might tell him something, and the cold ran the gold leaves down the creek behind us, and after a long while he said, in a voice scraped down to the wood, "She'd be Nora Marsh, or Nora something. 15 years. The sheet says Ellison." He looked at me then, first time, and I watched something come up in his face that he'd had buried so long he'd likely forgotten the shape of it, and watched him stamp it down hard, the way you'd stamp a coal that landed on a dry floor. "Folks keep their born names for 100 reasons," he said. "Don't mean a thing." He bent and gathered his coat. "Why'd she be coming here?" "Holly's is failing," I said. "You knew that." He had known it. The whole valley knew it. Holly's Ellison, the proudest man God ever set on a horse, was 81 years old and dying by inches in the big house he'd built. All his cattle sold off. The great spread shrunk down to the home place and a hired couple to nurse him, and not one living soul of his own blood within 2 days' ride. He'd outlived his pride into a loneliness, so complete the town had stopped gossiping about it because there was no sport in it anymore. "She's coming to bury her father," Eli said, "or near enough to it, that's all that is." He shrugged into his coat. "It's nothing to do with me." "Course not," I said. "It isn't a sow." I said course not. I turned my horse. "Thursday, noon stage. I only thought you'd want to know which day not to come to town." I should not have said it that way. I'd meant it kind, meant to give him room to stay up his mountain and not have to stand on the boardwalk with the whole town watching him watch a coach. But Eli Renner heard it the way a proud man hears everything, which is as a thing to be answered, and I saw it land, and I rode back down to Cedar Bend not knowing if I'd kept him away or just guaranteed he'd come. He came. Thursday noon, I had the team backed and the coach swept, and the dust was up on the far rise, and there, across the road, leaning on the post outside the mercantile with his hat down and his hands in his coat like he just happened to be in town for nails, was Eli Renner. He didn't look at the road. He looked at the mercantile window like the bolts of cloth in it were the most fascinating thing in the territory. But he was there. 15 years he'd kept off that boardwalk at stage time, and the one day the name on the list was hers, he was there. The coach came down off the bluff and through the river ford and up the last grade with the 4 horses blowing and the driver hauling them down, and it rocked into my office and stood, and the dust caught up and rolled over all of us, and I went to the door and let the step down with my own hands. She came out slow. I'd have known her in the dark. 15 years had laid a gray through her hair and a fine weather of lines at her eyes, and she'd gone from a girl to a woman full grown, but the steadiness was the same, that look-you-straight steadiness you could lean a ladder on, and she set her foot on my step and put her hand in mine and said, "Mr. Pike, you shod my mare. You're the only face in this town I'd have been glad to see." And her voice broke just slightly on the last of it, and I held her hand in both of mine, and I didn't trust myself to say much. "Welcome home, Miss Nora," I managed. "It isn't home anymore," she said gently, and then she straightened and turned to hand down the person behind her, and that's when I saw the child. A girl, 8, perhaps 9, with dark, serious eyes and a too big coat and a way of holding tight to Nora's sleeve that told you the whole of her history without a word of it spoken. Nora brought her down the step and kept a hand on her shoulder and said to me, but really to the town, to the air, to the years, "This is Sadie. She's mine now. Her people died in the halcyon fever 2 winters back and there was no one, and so there's me." She said it the way she'd once stood up in her father's front room, daring the world to make something of it. The world that day had the sense not to. And across the road, in the rolling dust, Eli Renner had turned from the mercantile window at last, and was standing with his hat in his hand. I never once in 15 years saw that man take his hat off on the street, looking at her like a man looks at a thing he had decided was dead and finds is only sleeping. She felt it. A body always feels that. She turned her head and she found him across the road, and the whole street, which had been pretending mightily not to watch, gave up pretending. Neither of them moved for the length of a long breath. Then Nora Ellison did the bravest thing I saw in the whole of this, braver than the front room, braver than the carpetbag and the 2 days' ride. She took her hand off the child's shoulder and she walked across that road straight, the way she looked at you, and she stopped in front of Eli Renner and she said, in a voice the whole boardwalk could hear and that did not shake at all, "Hello, Eli." And the hardest man in the High Valley, the flint-cord rancher who'd buried 15 women's pies and proposals without a crack, stood there with his hat in his 2 hands and could not get a single word up out of his chest, and finally said the only thing in him, which was her name. Nora, just that, like he was testing whether the word still worked. "You came down for the stage," she said. "I came for nails," said Eli Renner, and I swear before God that the whole street wanted to weep and laugh at once, because there was the man entire 15 years of waiting, and he stood in front of it and said he'd come for nails. She looked at him a moment longer. Then something moved behind her eyes, old hurt, I thought, the door coming down, and she said more quietly, "It's good you've done well for yourself. I always heard you would." And there it was, plain as the dust. She still thought he'd left her. 15 years and she still believed the hired man had ridden off and never written, had come home rich and never come for her, had stood on a boardwalk and managed nails. And he, looking at the gray in her hair and the carpetbag, and the child she'd raised that wasn't his, still believed she'd waited a decent while, and then built a life and shut the door. 2 people standing a yard apart, each one certain the other had done the leaving. "I'm sorry about your father," Eli said. He's failing, they say." "He's dying," she said with that terrible Ellison plainness. "I've come to be with him for it, and to settle the place after." She gathered the child. "I won't keep you from your nails, Eli." And she turned and walked back to where I stood, and I got her bag and the child's small bundle, and I drove her out to the Ellison house myself, and Eli Renner stood in the road with his hat in his hands until we were clean out of sight. And then the mercantile man told me. He went in and bought a keg of nails he did not need and rode back up his mountain. That's how the return began, not with the truth, with 2 more proud silences set down on top of 15 years of them. It might have ended there too. It nearly did. If it had been left to the 2 of them, they'd have circled each other at that yard's distance till one of them died, each too gutted by the old certainty to risk asking the question that would have cracked it open. It took the letter to do that. And the letter, after all those years, came out of the last place on earth either of them would have looked, out of the hand of the proud man himself. Holly's Ellison was a week dying after she came, and they were a hard week, and then, near the end, a strange and softening one. I had it from Nora later, much of it, and from the woman who nursed him, and I set it down here as true as I can. She nursed him herself those last days. Whatever lay between them, and a mountain lay between them, the front room, the carpetbag, the 15 years of his pride costing her her life, she nursed him with her own hands, because that was the make of her, and because, she told me once, he was a hard man and a wrong one, but he was wrong out of loving me too tight, and there's worse things a father can be. She'd sit by him in the long nights and read to him, and he'd drift and surface. and the dying loosened something in him that 81 years of pride had held shut. And on one of those last nights, lucid and frightened the way the dying get, Hollis Ellison told his daughter what he'd done. He'd taken the letter. That first winter, 15 years gone, when Eli's letter had come down with the freight from the far north, addressed to Miss Nora Ellison, Cedar Bend, in a hand Hollis didn't know but could guess it had come, as all the valley's mail came in those days through the Cedar Bend store, and Hollis Ellison, who owned the store and the man who ran it both, had been told of it and had ridden in and had taken it. He told himself he was protecting her. That's the thing about a proud man's sins. He commits them in the firm belief they're kindnesses. He told himself the hired man would only break her worse, would only pull her down into the want Hollis had sworn she'd never know, and that a clean cut now was a mercy against a slow ruin later. So he'd taken the letter, and he had not burned it. He could never quite bring himself to burn it, and that mattered. That was the one window in the whole wall of him, and he'd kept it. 15 years. He told her where. In the strongbox in the floor of the big front room, under the loose board by the hearth where she'd warmed her feet as a girl, with the deeds and the bonds and everything Hollis Ellison had valued. There, with the things he valued, was the letter he'd stolen, kept all that time like a stone he couldn't set down. Why? She asked him, just that. She told me she couldn't manage more than the one word. And the proudest man God ever set on a horse, 3 days from his grave, said to his daughter, because every time I near burned it, I knew I'd be burning the only proof I ever had that a man loved you true, and I could live being the man who kept you from him. I could not live being the man who destroyed the proof he was real. He'd wept then, she said, first time in her life she'd seen it. I was wrong, Nora. I bought you a long loneliness and called it your safety. Get the letter. Read what I cost you. And then, if there's any of it left to save, God knows there mayn't be, go and save it, and don't be the fool I was. He died 2 nights after. Hard man, wrong man, and at the very end, by the grace that's sometimes given even to the proud, an honest one. She didn't open the floor that night nor the next. She buried her father first, small graveside, the preacher, the hired couple, me, and Eli Renner standing well back among the cedars where he thought no one saw him, hat in his hands again. She got through the burying. And then, the evening after, alone in the big front room with the child asleep upstairs, Nora Ellison knelt by the cold hearth and pried up the loose board and opened her father's strongbox and found, on top of the deeds to everything he'd ever owned, a letter 15 years old, the ink gone brown, the fold worn soft as cloth from a man's hands taking it out, and putting it back 1,000 times across 15 years of not being able to burn it. She read it that night by the fire she built up special, and she read it, she told me, perhaps 20 times before the dawn. I have read it since. She showed it to me after, because she said I'd carried enough of their letters in my time to have earned the last one. I won't set the whole of it down. Some words aren't meant for a stranger's eye even now, but I'll tell you the bones of it, because the bones are the thing. He'd made it true, was the heart of it. He wrote her from that frozen line camp to say he'd done what he set out to do, had wages saved, and a claim filed, and a quarter section coming that would be his own free ground, and that he was no longer a man with nothing in his hands, and that the something he'd made for one reason only, which was to come back down the mountain and stand in front of her father as a man who could be refused for no honest cause. He asked her to wait. He asked it plain and humble, no flowers on it. Wait for me one more season, Nora. I'm nearly a man worth your waiting, and the day I am I'll come down that road, and not your father nor God himself will turn me from your gate. And he closed it. This is the part she read the 20 times he closed it. I never asked you to wait while I had nothing to offer you but the asking. Now I have a life to set beside yours equal, and I'm asking. Meet me at the gate come spring. I'll be the man coming down the road with his hat in his hand. Yours and no others, while there's breath in me, Eli. Spring had come. He'd come down the road, and he'd been told she was gone, and he'd read the going as her answer, and she'd never gotten the asking at all. And so the man had stood at the empty gate that spring believing he'd come too late, and the woman had stood at it the winter before believing he'd never come, and the only thing that had ever stood between them was a proud man's hand on a single envelope. You understand now why I say the years were stolen. Not lost. Stolen, by a theft so quiet the thief himself near forgot he'd done it, till the dying made him own it. She rode up to Dawn Fork the next morning. She didn't send word, didn't dress for it, didn't wait for a decent interval after her father's burying. She put the child up behind her on the Ellison mare at first light and rode straight up Quail Creek to Eli Renner's door with the letter inside her coat against her heart, and she got down in his yard, and he came out of the barn with a bridle in his hand and stopped dead. I wasn't there for this part, but she told it to me so many times in the good years after, sitting on their porch of an evening, that I can give it to you near as if I'd stood in the yard myself. He thought, seeing her ride and like that she'd come to settle the old account, to tell him to his face that she knew he'd run off and made his money and never come for her, and to ask him how he could have. He braced for it. He'd have taken it, too. He'd decided long ago he had it coming. So he stood there with the bridle and waited for her to open the wound. Instead, she walked up to him and took the letter out of her coat and held it up between them, the brown old paper shaking just a little in the cold, and she said, "Did you write this?" He looked at it. He didn't need to read it. He'd written it kneeling on a frozen dirt floor with the ink thawing over a candle, and a man knows the look of the only true thing he ever wrote. The color went out of him. "Where?" he said. "Where in God's name did you?" My father kept it. Her voice was steady, but the tears were running plain down her face now, both of them, all the years of them. 15 years, Eli. He took it from the freight and he kept it in the floor with his deeds, and he told me where on his deathbed because he couldn't die a liar. You wrote, you asked me to wait, you came down in the spring. She pressed the letter against his chest with her flat hand, the way you'd press on a wound. I never got it. I thought you'd left me at the gate. I waited the whole winter and no word came, and the whole town said you'd run. And Eli, I never married him. I never married anyone. I refused the lot of them, and I went south, and I taught other people's children for 15 years because I'd been loved true once and I would not put a lie in its place. And the whole time, the thing I was holding out for was sitting in my father's floor. And Eli Renner, the flint-cord, hat-keeping, 15-year silent hardest man in the High Valley, took the letter out of her hand and held it. And then he put his arms around her and the child both, awkward as a barn beam, 15 years out of practice, and he wept into her gray hair in his own cold yard. And the only words he could find, she said, the only ones over and over, were, "I came down in the spring, Nora. I came down. I came down." As though if he said it enough times, the years would hear him and give themselves back. They didn't get the years back. Nobody does. But they got what was left, and I'm here to tell you that what's left, when two people have wanted nothing else for 15 years, is a powerful great deal. It wasn't all smooth from that yard on. I'd be lying to you if I made it so, and they'd neither of them thank me for a lie. There was a hard reckoning in it still, even with the letter read. Nora had years of believing the worst of him to unlearn, and a body doesn't unlearn 15 years in a morning, even with the proof in her hand. There were evenings that first month, she told me, when an old reflex of hurt would rise in her, and she'd find herself half cold to him over nothing, punishing him out of habit for a thing he hadn't done. And Eli had got so deep into the rock of his solitude that he'd half forgotten how to let a person all the way in. And there were times the old flint came up, and he'd go silent and ride off up the creek alone the way he'd done for 15 years. And she'd have to learn that the silence wasn't him leaving. It was only him being a man who taught himself not to need, trying to learn the opposite at 50. And there was the matter of the proud man's ghost between them. Holly's had stolen their life, and he was the woman's own father, and she had loved him even being wrong, and Eli had to find a way to lay that down, to not spend what was left of his own life hating a dead man for the years a dead man had cost him. That was the hardest of it, I think. He came to it slow. What turned him in the end was a thing Nora said to him on the porch one night that I'll carry with me. She said, "If you spend the rest of your days hatting my father for stealing 15 years, then he's stolen the rest of them too. He won twice. Don't let him win twice, Eli." And the rancher sat with that a long while in the dark, and then he said, "He kept it. He could have burned it, and he kept it. That's the part I'll hold to." A man who keeps the proof against himself 15 years isn't all the way lost. And after that he let it go, mostly. The way you let go of a stone you've carried so long your hands grown around it, slow, and with an ache where it was, but you let it go. They were married in the spring. It seemed right to both of them to wait the winter, 15 years, and they'd wait one more season. But this one on purpose. This one with the date set and the bands read and the whole valley invited. The opposite in every way of the silence that had held them. They were married at the old schoolhouse gate. The first one. Out past the Ellison line where the floods had taken the plank building, where there was nothing left but the sagging cedar gate on the fence that fenced nothing. The gate to nowhere where two young people had once stood and been equal across the rails. Eli had it rebuilt for the day, set new posts, hung a new cedar gate, true and square, and the preacher stood on one side and the two of them on the other, and they were married across that gate the way they'd courted across it, and the whole town came, the same town that had spent 15 years telling the story wrong, and not one of them dared tell it wrong again. The child stood up with them, Sadie. She carried the rings. She'd taken to Eli the way wary children take to the few grown folks they decide are safe, slow, and then completely. And by the wedding she was riding up the creek behind him on his big horse and calling him by his name in a way that had the whole question already settled. He adopted her proper that summer, made her a renner in the law the way she was already a renner in the fact, and I will tell you that the sight of that hard, solitary man teaching a fever-orphaned girl to set a horse and read the weather and bait a hook was a thing that made grown men in this valley go quiet and look at their boots. They built the home out of the two halves they each came with. Nora wouldn't sell the Ellison place, too much of her father in it, too much of her young self, so they kept it and worked it, and Eli brought his Dawn Fork herd down to the lower ground in the hard months, and the two spreads became one good ranch under one brand. And she reopened the school. That was the first thing she did with her own money. The spring they wed, built a proper schoolhouse in Cedar Bend. A real one this time, of milled lumber with a bell and a stove. And she taught in it for 20 years, taught half the grown men and women in this valley their letters, and never once took a wage for it. The same as when she was 19 and taught in the Linta for nothing, because she couldn't abide a child unable to read his own Bible. I'd drive out to Dawn Fork of a Sunday in the good years and sit on their porch and watch them. Two gray heads. He'd got soft around her in a way the valley would never have believed of the flint-cord rancher. He'd reach over and tuck a loose strand of her hair without seeming to know he was doing it. The way a man does a thing his hands have wanted to do for 30 years and finally can. And she'd lean into it. And the girl would come banging out of the house with some question or some creature she'd caught, and the two of them would turn to her together, and I'd sit there an old man on their porch and think. It came down the road in the end. Late. Too late to give them their youth, but it came. Holly's Ellison's grave is up on the rise behind the home place, and I'll tell you a thing about that grave that closes this for me. Nora tends it. Of course she does, that's the make of her. But Eli tends it too. The man who lost 15 years to Holly's Ellison's pride walks up that rise of a Sunday and pulls the weeds off the proud man's grave with his own hands. And I asked him once why, plain, the way you can ask a man you've known 60 years. And Eli Renner looked off down the valley toward the gate where he married her, and he said, because he kept it, Asa. 15 years he could have burned the only proof I ever loved her true, and he couldn't do it. He hid it where he hid the things he loved. He pulled a weed. A man who does that hasn't got hate in him, only fear, and I've had my fill of letting fear run a life, his or mine. He stood up off the grave and dusted his knees. Besides, he's the reason there was a letter to find. If he'd burned it that first winter, she'd have died down in Halcyon thinking I ran, and I'd have died up this mountain thinking she chose another, and neither of us would ever once have known we were both still standing at the same gate. He put his hat back on. He cost us everything, and he saved us the one thing. I can pull a few weeds for a man like that. That's the truth of it, the whole truth, set down at last by the one who carried their letters and shod the girl's mare, and stood at both the parting and the return. I'm an old man now. Eli's gone these 4 years. Nora followed him the next spring, the way the long-married often do, as though there's no good reason to wait once the waiting's lost its object. They're up on the rise together now, the two of them, near her hard, wrong, honest father, and the gate they married at still stands out past the Ellison line, because Eli set those posts deep and true, the way he did everything once he decided it was worth the doing. Sometimes of an evening I drive out and stand at it, the gate to nowhere, the fence that fences nothing. And I think about a girl of 19 and a hired man of 22, leaning on the opposite rails of it in the long blue light, equal, before the world got its proud hands on them. And I think about the same two, gray and weathered and finally let alone, married across it at last with a fever-orphan child holding the rings. And I think that the distance between those two pictures was 15 stolen years, and one letter that a proud man couldn't burn. And I take off my hat, the way Eli taught the whole valley to do at that gate, and I stand there till the stars come out, the way they used to. It came down the road in the end. Late, but it came. And a thing that comes that late after that long and is still that whole. I have lived a long life in a hard country, and I am here to tell you there is nothing on this earth I'd kneel to sooner.